that, I'd like to move on to Matt Spitzer. Again, he is going to be talking about the Open Science Framework for Connecting Institutional Research. And Matt, are you there with us?
I am, and you can see my slides okay?
We can.
Indeed. Great. Well, thanks, everybody. And that was actually probably a great way to start with Jen's presentation, because there's a couple of use cases that we're dealing with that might actually be perhaps weigh in on some of that, and actually the metadata question is something that we're looking at as well. So I'd be very curious to have some feedback at the end. Like you said, I'm with the Center for Open Science. We're a nonprofit organization that is funded by a selection of family foundations and government entities, as you can see there at the bottom of the slide. And our primary mission is to improve the rigor, the transparency, and the reproducibility of scientific research. And we do that in a number of ways. I'm only going to be talking about the technology side today, obviously, but just so you know, we also do the two other sort of legs of the stool, if you will, to train researchers on how to do reproducible and more transparent research practices, as well as work on the incentives, which I mean by that working with publishers and funders and how they incentivize researchers to do things like share their data and make their research more open. Because obviously, if we don't change how researchers are incentivized, we're not all going to maybe jump into the fray, except for the early idealists, of course. But I'll mainly talk about the technology that we build, which we build as public goods infrastructure, all free and open source tools to help individual researchers and increasingly their institutions provide enhanced discoverability, collaboration, sharing, and actually to solving a lot of the challenges that researchers have when they tackle either small projects or even, more importantly, the large collaborative research projects, some of which we're known for. Most of you I talk to have heard of the center because of our involvement in the reproducibility project for psychology. And most recently, that was just the first few findings were published a few weeks ago, the reproducibility project in cancer biology. We are managing those projects as part of our sort of research on the practices of research. But the vast majority of what our resources go to is to build the technology systems that we use and promote. The primary tool we build here is the Open Science Framework. And to give you a little bit of context for what that is, I'm going to go into specific institution use cases. But it is designed as an open workflow tool for researchers to manage a research project from beginning to end, full life cycle, and actually to make those individual research projects essentially more extensible to go around this cycle again by yourself or by another researcher. So we build components and parts of the tool that hopefully address all of these, but we don't build them in the sense that you have to come and use our tool and nothing else, because we want to meet researchers where they are, and everyone who has a workflow has a preference for how they do things, how they manage their data, how they store their data. So the way we do that is actually we connect to other tools. We connect to citation tools, we connect to design tools, study design tools, data storage tools, repository tools. A lot of these are in place already, and a lot of them are being built today by us and by the community of open source developers. So if you'd like to use Dropbox and you'd like to use Dataverse or Figshare or Dryad, you can use those tools, but use them in a way that's connected, and so you eliminate the data silos. That's a lot of what we work on, is helping researchers create a more fluid way to manage their data, so that at the end of the day, when their funder or their publisher or their institution says, now we want you to curate that data, preserve it, archive it, share it, it's not a burden to the researcher. It's actually as easy as pressing a button and saying, I'm ready to share. We all know institutional repository compliance is extremely low, and we think that by connecting all of these services into a workflow that can lead to an institutional repository would be much more an improved workflow. And I'll share a little bit about a pilot project we're working on to do that. Again, I'm really just going to talk about the institutional approach, but to set a little bit of a bigger picture of what we're doing is we have this tool called the Open Science Framework, which is comprised of these common tools that we all need to operate on the internet. You know, authentication, file upload, file rendering, a lot of these types of services, and we've built it in a modular way that we can actually build lots of different systems on top of that. So we have our OSF preprints now that we've released, and we're building multiple versions of those preprints for different communities. So we've put up the infrastructure for SocArchive, Engineer Archive, SciArchive, and now AgRchive, which just launched earlier this week, using that same toolkit just in a modular way. So it allows us to do a preprint service. It allows us to build institutional tools for schools like NYU and Notre Dame. It allows us to build registries and other repositories of data for a lot of different groups that don't have the funds to go out and build original infrastructure to solve these needs. They want to use tools that everyone else is using, and we can provide some really nice synergy across the top of them by with integrated search. So specifically for institutions, this came out of some work with Notre Dame, especially last year. We began piloting this additional layer on the OSF last year to really solve these challenges. You know, that gap between when research is funded and when it's published is often a black hole at a lot of institutions. Where's the data going? Is it ever going to be archived? Is it ever going to be published? So providing visibility there, insight on how collaboration is happening. That interdisciplinary research is a really growing trend, and institutions are sometimes struggling to provide tools and frameworks for a biologist and a computational scientist to work collaboratively, and we think that we can help with that. And then I think one of the most really fascinating ones I've come across is actually providing an access to the workflows. And what I mean by that is in the research data services side of things, so at your libraries, there are professionals there that can help you curate and archive the data in appropriate repositories. But most often they're asked to work with researchers when they're given an email with a file attached to it. And that's completely out of context and may not be the file that they should be helping you with. So by having an open workflow tool like the OSF, you can actually invite that curation expert into your project space temporarily or with a read-only link that allows them to interact with a researcher right where they're working, right where their workflow tools are all connected. And all of this information in this slide deck, by the way, is on our is on a site which I'll share the link to at the end, and it was on the first slide as well. So we're working with a lot of institutions to do this. This is our current sort of partner base using the OSF, and a few that will be added. So a number here in the Southeast, UVA, VCU, Virginia Tech. We've had conversations with lots and lots of other ones, including folks down at Georgia State, North Carolina State, and others. And they're all piloting and testing this in various ways. So they're not doing it the same. They're all sort of pushing it out in different ways. But you notice there's some other really small groups on here. The Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, the Mind Life Institute, which studies contemplative sciences. These are extremely small groups that don't have institutional repositories, nor where they have the funds to build one. So they're able to use our public good infrastructure to help promote the sharing of the research and data that they have so that others can find it and make it more discoverable. And it starts with using the OSF. I'm not going to cover a lot of what the OSF is as a standalone tool, so hopefully some of you know about it, but it is a free and open source tool. Anyone can go there and create an account today at osf.io. With institutions, we add the layer of having single sign-on. So, for instance, if you were to click on osf.nyu.edu there, that would actually take you to NYU's page. And if you had NYU credentials, you could log in directly with your institutional ID. We also have a ORCID integration as well for login. And what you get at these institutional pages is simply another layer on top of what's already at the OSF. So UVA is a good example where we had probably about 100 users of the OSF there when we turned this on. And it provides a public hub of research that's being shared at that institution. Some of it may be active research, some of it may be past research, some of it may be a placeholder for a grant that's been awarded. But what you can quickly do is search across this collection of research projects for things like the researcher. Who is Brian Nosek working with? Is he working with Jordan? And how many projects are they working on? I can get some basic information about the project. And this is all up to the researcher's discretion. You don't have to share anything. You can have a completely private project, but if you make it public, it will show up here and it'll be discoverable. And we provide persistent identifiers with projects and files so that if you embed a link in an article, you can get linked back to that project, and that project may lead someone to discover additional research by you or at your institution. You can also search across these for things like if I search for bias, I find the two projects that are dealing with bias in their title, description, or in the metadata tags. So I can easily search across the entire collection of research here at UVA to find a particular topic that I'm interested in. I don't have to go to 5 different department websites to see who's studying it. I can actually just look on it here. On the project page itself, whoops, I skipped one slide there. Let me go back. On the project page itself, it's the same as the OSF has always been, a project to store data and structure your project with multiple collaborators. We just add the extra little bit of metadata that is affiliation with UVA. And we can't have multiple affiliations. We have lots of projects where there are researchers at 2 institutions, and UVA's logo and VCU logos will be on the same project. And that project will show up in both institutional landing pages, so it's discoverable from both entry points. I picked out two use cases for the OSF that I thought might be relevant just for general use, and actually was really relevant based on Jen's discussion earlier. A lot of times people see the OSF as a place to store data, and although that's not really our primary goal to be a data repository, we simply want to complement the other tools that are out there, Amazon S3 and Dryad and Dropbox. But we often find that researchers don't have a good place to store the types of data that they want to store at their institution. And a really good example of this is Adam Summers. He's a fish biologist at University of Washington. He's very well known as Fish Guy, and you can read that Wired article about him. He's scanning fish, and his goal is to scan all fish. That's a lot of scans. And his institution told him they didn't have a place for him to store that data. So he started storing that on here, and in fact, he drove us to make his STL files renderable and interactive on our browser. So this is a scan of a fish. A lot of these are very, very, very small species. And the use case for this is actually other researchers are 3D printing these scans to study them in larger sizes. And there's several hundred fish now scanned on there, and other researchers are now contributing to that as a community sourced project to put all scans of fish into this project on the OSF. And he's quite well known on Twitter. He gets a lot of people talking about what they're doing with his fish scan, so it's an interesting use case. The other one is not so much about the data, but what you get from putting data into a public shareable repository. And a lot of what institutions worry about is citations, and then certainly that's an important part of the story. A more significant part of the story is the impact of that research beyond citations. So any public project on the OSF gives you a few pieces of data. It gives you things like where are your visits and referrals coming from, how many visits you're having. More granularly than that, how many downloads of your data set is happening. And then people can actually take your project and fork it. So if you're familiar with GitHub, where you can fork a piece of code and have it copied into your workspace, we do the same thing with the metadata of the original source of that fork being copied into your project so that you can extend a research project when you find a piece of data or a protocols or methods that you want to use in your own research space. You can do that as well, and you can actually track those. If they're public, you can identify them, and so you can actually physically represent or visually represent the standing on shoulders of giants. Lots of other features. I'm not going to go into any more of these, but this is actually, I just pulled these out from our table of contents from our help documentation, but if you have interest in any one of these other sort of functions and features of the OSF, I'd be happy to answer any of those questions. A couple of quick pilots that I wanted to make sure folks were aware of. Both of them involve Notre Dame, but now we've expanded to a few other groups. The first one, and this was actually some of the original sort of starting point for the institution's work that we've done, is Notre Dame wanted to build a service to preserve the research code that is being used to analyze data and prepare data sets in a lot of different disciplines. So working through their Center for Research Computing, they were going to build an ingest engine where researchers could come in and drop in their Dropbox data and their GitHub file and run things on a Docker container that would then preserve that Docker container for other researchers to use at a later time. And they were beginning the process of trying to figure out how to build all the APIs to all the different services that they would need to do that. We happened to present the OSF around the same time, and they realized they didn't need all those APIs. They needed a single API to the OSF. So what you're seeing here, and it's kind of cut off, but what this image is here on the upper left is the OSF with a custom command line interface built into it that is connected directly to the High Performance Computing Center at the Center for Research, that is allowing the researcher on the OSF to identify a data source that's connected, so in this case the Dropbox file, a script which could be in a completely different location that's connected, a GitHub repo or something else like that, and they're able to execute that script on that data and put it into, and run it on the Docker container. Is there a question in the back? I saw a hand get raised.
Oh no, it's just stretching.
Just stretching, okay, no problem.
Good eye.
So this is being done with an NDS grant, and it's in a pilot phase. You can go and look at the presentation there at that link, and we hope to move this out of pilot into perhaps adoption by some other centers for research computing maybe later this year. The other one, which is also very interesting, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, is connections to institutional repositories. The group behind Fedora, so DuraSpace, Johns Hopkins, and Notre Dame are currently piloting and prototyping a service where an institutional repository would be able to ingest data from the Open Science Framework and pull that data into the institutional repository so that they can curate more of the research that's going on at their institution. A second phase of that would be a push of data from the OSF into the institutional repository, accessing a custom metadata form that would be associated with that institution's repository, so that researchers don't have to package something up in a different location and email it to another representative. They can simply push button, submit to their institutional repository, and then we would populate it with as much metadata as we already have, and they would simply fill in the gaps in order to get it into Curate-ND in this case, which is the institutional repository. So we believe very strongly that connecting the workflow is really critical to enabling change, and the change specifically is the transparency and ultimately the reproducibility of research. If you follow any of the reproducibility debates, it's not that the science being done is wrong. It's oftentimes that we can't even reproduce our own steps from a year ago that we did in our lab, much less expect anyone else who wants to build on our research to do the same. It's not that people are falsifying information. It's simply we don't have complete enough information to produce similar results of a paper that we studied and want to build on. So starting with this, but we think there's a lot more that we can do by connecting to other services, and I think that's really one of the calls to action that I'd be curious about this group giving us feedback on is how else could this model of providing a sort of a commons for research tools and services affect the goals of the hub. And so this is thinking about things like connecting to grant administration tools, IRB tools, other custom data collection workflows, obviously data management, HPC, and ultimately institution repositories, how we can bridge these together, not by locking anyone into any one particular service, but actually by connecting as many services as we need and providing a place for researchers to move data around very easily. Or actually, I always say, don't move your data around, leave it where it is, but connect your workflow to where the data should be. So if your data should live on Dryad, great. Just connect that to your research project in a way that you can cite it, share it, and collaborate on it. So we're doing a lot of these different things, and our goal is to build the infrastructure and actually let the branded versions of these be community generated. So similar to SocArchive, it's a group of sociologists that want to have a preprint service, and instead of fundraising $1 million to build that, we can provide that service for free, and we can duplicate and parallelize that infrastructure very, very easily and simply and at reduced costs. And part of that community, and this is another thing that I think might weigh in on the metadata discussion, is our project in association with ARL. This is the SHARE project. You can find this at share.osf.io. What this is a metadata harvester and normalizer service. We are currently sourcing data from 146 different repositories, including things like NIH Commons, institutional repositories, a lot of publisher repositories. So these are APIs, feeds, application components that are brought in, and the metadata is harvested and normalized. And that's a big job. And it's being done as much as we can by automated filtering, but we actually have a crew of about 40 data curation associates that are mostly helping to additionally normalize data at institutions. So one institution's data can be more easily normalized by that community because they know more about it. This is actually what's feeding our preprint service. So we're actually aggregating all of the preprints from arXiv, bioRxiv, and PeerJ into our OSF preprints, in addition to the services that we're standing up on top of it, so that you have a single location to search 2 million preprints. You can search for other data events. These are mostly research events, by the way. These are publications, grants, data repository submissions. You can search on that and actually filter it by funder, source, all different kinds of things. You can set up notification feeds. One of the really cool things that we're just now piloting, this is the last thing I'll show, is a pilot project with UC San Diego to use SHARE to create an institutional dashboard of research events. This is simply in pilot right now, demonstration purposes. But what this is doing is actually sourcing all of those locations, including their own repository of information, to come up with all of the events that are coming out of the UC San Diego and associated faculty and staff. And you'll be able to sort to it by type, by collection, by contributors to it. So you can obviously see the Scripps Institute is a primary contributor there. And this is really just our first prototype of doing this, and we're hoping to again expand on this in the future. So what I'll leave you with is just, what can you do is hopefully suggest the OSF to research teams that need a tool today to solve collaboration and sharing challenges. Explore using the OSF if that's something that makes sense to complement the other services that you have. add your institution repositories or a repository that you'd like to use, suggest that they feed into Share so that it's more discoverable. To hopefully solve that metadata challenge that I asked Jen about. I was curious if there were other solutions out there. And then the workshops that we hold, if that's of interest to anybody. And you know, we're building this as a community-supported model, and so certainly other developer communities are critical to our success. And if you have ideas or connections to make, we're always open to those. And this presentation is available at that link there at the bottom. And I, of course, always welcome any emails after the fact if you have specific questions. And with that, I'll leave it to any questions anyone has today.
Okay, outstanding. So thank you, Matt. I could probably guess that maybe Mike or Regan might have questions, particularly to your question about connecting with the hub and such. But if other folks have questions too, we open it up to the floor.
Oh yeah, this is Mike. No, I think this is really nicely done. I'm really interested in, you know, there are a lot of similar qualities for, you know, the stuff we worked on with Cyverse, and, you know, I'm interested, are you participating in that NDS universally accessible public API, you know, standard metadata and handles, and being able to expose yourself to metadata harvesting from NDS? Is that, are you kind of tapped into that project?
I believe the Share group is. I'm not as directly involved in that piece of it, but I believe there is some connection there because of the grant that we had to do that original dashboard was NDS related. But certainly our intention of this is that the APIs for all of these tools, both the OSF and Share, are completely open and can be built upon to harvest this data into other use cases. So that's certainly the intention behind it. The Share tool itself is actually kind of a bare bones. We don't really expect anyone to go there and effectively use the 20 million records that are there. We certainly expect there to be use cases like the preprints where we're building an interface that harvests a certain subset of that data so that it can serve a specific need within a community, either by type, by source, or some other filter that makes sense. I think the biggest challenge there as you get into more granular use cases is that most of the sources that are providing data have extremely different ideas of structured metadata.
Right, exactly. Yeah, yeah. So I don't have what I did is while you were talking, I started poking around in GitHub and looking for extension points and stuff like that. I think this stuff is really neat. It's really well done. So I don't have I need to do a little digging around in the APIs, but I could certainly see, at least for some of our DFC purposes, like I'd be interested in mining, like what are the extension points so that, you know, data that's held in services like DFC could be exposed. And we work a lot with the Dataverse people too, especially at the Odom Institute here at UNC. So yeah. I know that's very vague, but anyways, all I'm saying is, like, as you're talking, I was kind of looking around in the background, and it looks like it's extremely well done, and I might try to ping you later offline if that's possible to just kind of talk some about that. But I think this is the kind of thing, you know, a question generally for the data hubs is, are they looking for, you know, a sort of a public face or a commons, you know, like what's the roadmap for how you sort of embody what the big data hubs look like? And that's sufficiently vague, and I'm rambling, so I'll stop there. But really
yeah,
cool.
Curious to answer the same question. But just for anybody who is interested in the APIs, we do surface all that information. We do have a project underway to improve some of this documentation. It's certainly always a challenge to keep that up to date and as usable as we'd like. So if you have any suggestions or issues there, certainly let us know, and we can work with you directly.
Does anybody else have questions?
Absolutely. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Anyone on the line have questions?
This is Jen. I've got one about Share.
Go ahead, Jen.
Forgive me, this kind of aggregation is a little outside my ken, so I'm wondering, you seem to be asking for a lot of consent from institutions for being registered. Is that a matter of policy, or is it a beta release thing? I just looked at my own institutional repository. I think we're not in there. But just sort of sitting there on the homepage, we have like an RSS feed and some stuff. Like, I presume services exist frequently. Are you expecting expecting at some point to just harvest such services as are just openly available?
Yeah.
Or would you do it one institution registering formally at a time?
Yeah, we do offer, if you go to the Share OSF site, you can register your repository and submit the information, and we'll build a harvester for it. Each one has to be looked at individually by a developer to, again, normalize the metadata. We, in some cases, will actually go out and request permission to harvest because it's a central, like for the preprints is a good example. I think we had a few of them in there, but we basically went to bioRxiv and said, hey, we're gonna start harvesting that for this purpose. Does that make sense? And they were very supportive, and actually they made some changes because a lot of these APIs are restricted in how far back you can harvest, or there's limitations in the calls. And so we've been able to work with a lot of the repositories to overcome those challenges and provide a more seamless integration or at least a seamless flow of the data. So I think the first step is if you want to put your data into it and have it contribute is just to go ahead and register your source. And then if you have other sources, it's one of two ways. You can either contact us and we can perhaps approach them, or the easiest step is actually for you to let the other repositories know, hey, if we all put our data in there, this will be a usable source.
Okay, so you find that you need a human contact for logistical assistance anyway?
At least to get things started and for permission. If the API is open, we generally can do it, but we do like to work with people directly.
Okay.
Do other folks have questions? Anyone in the room? Okay, give a moment, see if there's any online questions, further online questions. So you've muted a few folks. Are they able to unmute themselves if they have a question?
Most folks are muted. Please unmute yourself if you wish to speak.
Okay. All right, last call. All right, not hearing any other further questions, then perhaps we shall close for the Friday. Matt and Jennifer, we really want to thank you for the wonderful presentations and all. Before people go, we want to mention that on March 10th?
31.
March 31st. On March 31st, we have presenters John Moore and Florence Hudson from Internet 2 community, supported by the NSF Regional Hubs. And March 31st, we also have Alex Feltus and Clarice Castillo for their CIDAS, National Cyber Infrastructure for Scientific Data Analysis at Scale. So we're very excited to have that. We will only have one in March because the Big Data Hubs are meeting for their annual meeting at NSF for the PIs. And then we will be bringing, after a few more sessions, the demos to a close. And if people have ideas for actions that we need to take, working group actions, we will transition from then on. So with that, thank you, Carl, for helping to get all the logistics set up, and thank you all for attending. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.